The words didn't come out as an outburst. They arrived slowly, with the weight of someone who had already reached the end long before speaking. Caitriona didn't raise her voice or dramatize the moment. She simply said she was done, and the finality of it unsettled everyone who heard. For years, her public life had been defined by balance. She appeared composed, measured, and carefully guarded, especially when questions drifted toward her personal world. That control had become part of her identity, something audiences mistook for stability. In reality, it was endurance. Those closest to her noticed the change before she ever spoke. She grew quieter in familiar spaces, less willing to explain decisions or soften silences. Conversations that once flowed easily now stopped short, as if she were conserving energy. When someone lives in restraint for too long, withdrawal is often the first sign of collapse. Her life with Tony McGill had been presented as private but intact. There were no public fights, no messy headlines, no obvious scandal demanding attention. On the surface, nothing appeared broken enough to justify such a decisive ending. That disconnect made her admission even more jarring. When Caitriona finally addressed it, the language she used was stark. She didn't talk about arguments or betrayal. She spoke about exhaustion, about waking up each day already depleted. The word, disgusted, wasn't aimed at a person, but at a life that no longer felt like her own. She described a growing sense of disappearance. Not physically, but emotionally, as if pieces of herself had been set aside one by one to keep things functioning. The more she tried to make it work quietly, the more distant she felt from the version of herself she recognized. That distance became unbearable. What shocked listeners most was her clarity. This wasn't confusion or heartbreak in motion, it was resolution. Caitriona didn't sound angry, and she didn't sound desperate. She sounded relieved to finally acknowledge what she had been carrying alone. She admitted that leaving wasn't sudden. The decision had formed over time, shaped by moments she never shared publicly. Long pauses, unspoken compromises, and the constant effort to appear unaffected had slowly eroded her sense of belonging. By the time she said she was done, she had already mourned the relationship. The phrase, "gone forever," wasn't meant to provoke fear. It reflected her refusal to revisit something she knew would not heal through repetition. Returning, even emotionally, felt like reopening a wound she had worked hard to close. Permanence, in this case, was protection. Those around her understood that this wasn't about escape. It was about reclaiming agency after years of living inside expectations that weren't hers alone. Caitriona had learned how easily silence can be mistaken for consent. Speaking now was her way of correcting that misunderstanding. She did not assign blame. There were no accusations, no attempts to paint herself as wronged or superior. Her focus remained on the internal toll of staying somewhere that no longer aligned with her emotional reality. Sometimes, the damage isn't visible until someone finally steps away. Public reaction came quickly but unevenly. Some expressed sympathy, others skepticism, and many struggled to reconcile the calm of her delivery with the severity of her words. That discomfort said more about expectations than about her truth. Not all endings arrive in chaos. Caitriona didn't ask for understanding. She didn't try to convince anyone that leaving was justified. She stated it as fact, not argument. That refusal to explain beyond what she offered marked a boundary she seemed determined to protect. What lingered after her admission was not scandal, but stillness. The kind that follows when something has been decided completely. There was no sense of waiting for a response or a reaction. Her words stood alone, firm and unembellished. In stepping away, Caitriona wasn't disappearing. She was choosing not to remain where her presence felt conditional or draining. Gone forever didn't mean erased, it meant finished. And in that finality, there was a quiet strength that made her decision impossible to dismiss. The decision did not arrive as an explosion, but as exhaustion finally speaking out loud. Those close to Caitriona Balfe described a moment when patience simply ran out, not in anger, but in quiet clarity. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public scenes, no ultimatums delivered through the press. Instead, there was a realization that staying had begun to cost more than leaving. For a long time, Caitriona had tried to make distance feel like stability. Life beside Tony McGill had been managed carefully, presented as calm and functional, even when it felt increasingly hollow. What looked balanced from the outside required constant emotional negotiation behind closed doors. Over time, that effort turned into fatigue she could no longer ignore. The word, disgusted, did not mean hatred. It meant revulsion at repetition, at pretending comfort where there was none. Caitriona wasn't reacting to a single event, but to a pattern that refused to change. The routines that once felt manageable began to feel suffocating. Those who noticed the shift saw it first in what she stopped doing. She withdrew from shared appearances, avoided conversations that required justification, and no longer corrected assumptions about her personal life. Silence replaced explanation, and that silence carried intention. It was the first step towards something irreversible. Privately, Caitriona spoke about feeling erased. Not by a person, but by a version of life that no longer reflected who she was becoming. The compromises she had made for peace slowly turned into compromises of self. At some point, staying started to feel like self-betrayal. The choice to leave was not impulsive. It followed months of emotional detachment, careful reflection, and conversations that went nowhere. Each attempt to repair the dynamic circled back to the same emptiness. When nothing changed, the decision stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling necessary. What surprised those around her was the absence of sadness. There was grief, yes, but also relief, the kind that arrives when resistance ends. Caitriona didn't frame the departure as failure. She framed it as refusal to continue a life that demanded constant emotional numbness. The phrase, "gone forever," was not about disappearance. It was about finality of intention, about closing a door without leaving it ajar. Caitriona did not plan to return, renegotiate, or soften the separation with ambiguity. Leaving meant leaving fully, without conditions or backtracking. Tony McGill's presence in the narrative became minimal by design. Caitriona did not speak publicly about blame or wrongdoing. She avoided details that would turn a personal decision into a spectacle. The point was not to expose someone else, but to reclaim herself. What followed was a visible shift in her energy. Those who encountered her afterward described a lighter presence, less guarded, more internally aligned. The tension that had defined her recent years began to dissolve. Even without public statements, the change was unmistakable. Career decisions soon reflected that internal break. Projects once delayed were reconsidered, priorities reshuffled, and long-postponed ideas revisited. Leaving a draining personal situation freed space for ambition that had been quietly stalled. The separation wasn't just emotional, it was directional. Fans sensed the change without needing confirmation. Interviews felt sharper, responses more grounded, and the practiced neutrality was gone. Caitriona no longer spoke as someone maintaining balance, but as someone standing firmly in choice. That confidence resonated. There was no attempt to rewrite the past. Caitriona did not deny what had been, nor did she romanticize endurance. She accepted that some chapters exist to be closed, not explained. Closure, for her, did not require audience approval. The disgust she felt was not toward a person, but toward stagnation. It was a rejection of a life that asked her to stay small and silent. Once that clarity arrived, staying became impossible. Leaving was no longer dramatic, it was logical. In the end, the story was less about departure and more about reclamation. Caitriona Balfe did not walk away in anger, but in alignment with herself. She didn't disappear, she moved forward without looking back. And sometimes, that is what being done truly means.